History isn't a static line drawn on a map. It's a shifting boundary, forged in the spaces where civilizations meet, clash, and blur together. From the bustling merchant ports of Tyre and the towering battlements of Carthage, to the cryptic whispers of the Delphic Oracle and the bloody waters of the Peloponnesian War, this is where the known world met the unknown. Welcome to Frontiers of Antiquity. Join us as we look beneath the surface of the classical world to uncover the human rivalries, the structural conflicts, and the ancient histories that built our modern world.
Imagine for a second that you are unrolling a scroll. It's pristine, incredibly fragile, and a massive 4 meters long. And as you spread it out, you see this beautiful, flowing, ancient Egyptian cursive script covering the papyrus. I mean, from a distance, it looks like a magnificent piece of classical art.
The kind of artifact that belongs into reinforced glass, you know?
Exactly, which is where it sits today in the Netherlands. But the aesthetic beauty of the artifact completely betrays the actual contents.
Oh, absolutely, because when you actually translate that elegant script, it suddenly reads exactly like a psychological horror story.
A total nightmare scenario. We are looking at descriptions of a river turning to blood, catastrophic natural disasters, and just a society collapsing almost overnight.
Yeah, and you read this text and immediately think, well, I know this story. I have heard this exact sequence of events before.
It is so incredibly visceral. Because you unroll a scroll expecting, I don't know, a royal decree or a trade ledger or maybe a polite letter between diplomats.
Right, it's a bureaucratic paperwork.
Yeah. But instead, you get a front row seat to an ancient apocalypse. And that jarring contrast is exactly why we are pulling out the sources for this deep dive.
It's a fascinating piece of history.
Today, we are looking at this specific, highly debated artifact. It's officially known as Papyrus Leiden I 344, but it's commonly referred to as the Ipuwer Papyrus.
And just for some quick background, the physical scroll was acquired by a collector named Giovanni Anastasi way back in 1828.
But we are approaching this text from a very specific angle today, which is the biblical archaeological perspective.
And the reason that perspective is so crucial here is that the text on this ancient Egyptian scroll bears a striking, almost uncomfortable resemblance to the book of Exodus.
Yeah, it really does. So our mission today is to figure out what you and I are actually looking at when we read this thing. Is this a literal eyewitness Egyptian account of the plagues of Egypt? Or is it something else entirely like a piece of hyperbolic ancient political philosophy?
It is a massive debate.
Okay, let's unpack this by looking at exactly what this 4-meter scroll says, because the raw, unfiltered imagery here is what makes this artifact so incredibly famous in the first place.
We really have to start with how the narrator sets the scene. The text is framed as a direct address by an Egyptian sage named Ipuwer.
Okay.
And he's speaking directly to a ruler, essentially giving a State of the Union address. But the State of the Union is absolute unmitigated chaos.
Yeah, Ipuwer describes a land that is just fundamentally broken. And the parallels to the biblical Exodus narrative jump right off the page, like demanding your attention. First, he explicitly states that the river is blood. And he doesn't just mention it as a passing metaphor. He describes the severe human toll, saying people loathe to drink from it, that they're desperately thirsting for water.
What's fascinating here is how neatly that maps onto the biblical timeline. You know, the very first plague is the Nile turning to blood.
Right, the very first one.
And we have to remember, the Nile was not just a river to the ancient Egyptians. It was the absolute lifeblood of their entire civilization. I mean, they received almost no rainfall.
So if the river goes bad.
Exactly. If the Nile failed or became undrinkable, it was a systemic failure of their entire world.
But Ipuwer doesn't stop at the water supply. He goes on to detail this massive wave of agricultural and animal ruin.
Oh yeah, it gets much worse.
He talks about the widespread death of cattle in the fields. He describes the complete failure of the grain and the barley crops. It's just a picture of all-consuming devastation that leaves the once fertile land completely barren.
And from a biblical archaeological perspective, that sequence aligns almost flawlessly with the middle plagues of Exodus.
How so?
Well, you have the Murrain, which was a severe infectious disease that struck livestock. Then you have the catastrophic hail, followed by the locusts.
Oh, right, which would just completely wipe out the Egyptian food supply.
Exactly. And the geographical scope Ipuwer describes is massive too. He mentions fire running high and a massive storm tearing through Upper Egypt, which is the southern region of the country, stretching down to modern Aswan.
Adding to that, he specifically notes that the land is without light. So you have the fire, the storms, the suffocating darkness. These heavily mirror the 7th and 9th biblical plagues.
It's eerie how closely it matches.
But it's not just the environmental disasters that make this text so wild to read. The environmental collapse triggers a complete social collapse. Ipuwer laments that death is literally everywhere, to the point where they are just burying people in the river.
And there's that one really dark detail.
Yeah, he even describes the children of nobles being dashed against walls or abandoned entirely.
Which, obviously, that detail about the death of the children specifically catches the attention of anyone studying the 10th plague of Exodus.
And the death of the firstborn.
Right, which was the final catalyst for the Israelites' departure.
And alongside that mass mourning, there is this profound, almost overnight social inversion. Ipuwer complains bitterly that slaves have suddenly taken the gold in the clothes of their masters.
Yes, the native elite, the people who used to run the country, are suddenly left completely destitute.
To put this in perspective for you listening, it's like reading a post-apocalyptic script where Wall Street bankers are suddenly begging for canned beans on the sidewalk, and the people who used to clean their offices are walking around wearing their Rolexes and living in their penthouses.
That is a perfect way to visualize the shock Ipuwer is conveying. It's a total upside-down world.
Yeah.
And that specific social inversion directly parallels the biblical account of the Israelites plundering the Egyptians before they fled.
Oh, right, where they asked for their gold and silver.
Exactly. The book of Exodus describes them asking their Egyptian neighbors for articles of silver, gold, and clothing, and leaving with the wealth of the nation.
So when you stack all of these thematic overlaps together, the blood, the dead livestock, the ruined crops, the darkness, the death of children, the sudden extreme wealth of the slave class, it creates a very compelling narrative puzzle.
A really dense puzzle.
With a list of parallels that specific, you would think this is a completely open and shut case of historical corroboration. You have the biblical text on one hand, and you have this ancient Egyptian scroll on the other, both seemingly describing the exact same bizarre sequence of events.
You think so, yeah.
Case closed, right?
Yep.
But because this is archaeology, it is never, ever that simple.
Far from it. To truly understand this artifact and why it's so fiercely debated, we have to separate the physical object itself from the intellectual content written on it.
Wait, what do you mean?
Because they belong to two completely different eras.
Hold on, let me make sure I'm following this. Are you saying the paper and the story are from different centuries? Walk us through how that works.
Yeah, let's start with the physical papyrus. The actual 4-meter scroll was found at Saqqara, which is an incredibly important ancient burial ground near modern Cairo.
Okay, got it.
That physical object was manufactured and written on during the Egyptian New Kingdom, specifically the 19th Dynasty, which places the ink and paper roughly between 1300 and 1200 BCE.
But how can historians be so precise about when the ink was actually put to the paper?
Because of the script it's written in, known as Hieratic, and the specific spelling variations the scribe used.
Hieratic? Is that like hieroglyphs?
Sort of, but not exactly. Hieratic isn't the formal carved hieroglyphs you see on temple walls. It was the cursive shorthand used by scribes and bureaucrats for everyday documents.
Oh, okay.
And paleographers, the experts who study ancient handwriting, can look at this scroll and see what they call Ramesside-style spelling quirks.
Kind of like dating an old English document.
Exactly. It's exactly like looking at an original American colonial document. You immediately know it's from the 1700s because they used an F shape instead of an S in certain words. Ancient Egyptian scribes had similar generational handwriting quirks.
So the physical artifact sitting in the museum firmly belongs to the 1300s or 1200s BCE.
That is the physical reality of the scroll. But the linguistic style of the composition itself, the actual grammar, the vocabulary, the way the sentences are structured, belongs to a completely different era.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Paleographers study the roots of the words and the idioms, and they date the original composition of Ipuwer's story all the way back to the Middle Kingdom.
Which is when exactly?
That is roughly between 1991 and 1803 BCE.
Okay, I need to do the math on this because this creates a massive chronological problem. Standard biblical timelines place the events of the Exodus around either 1446 BCE or maybe 1270 BCE, depending on which scholar you ask. But the actual language of this story dates back to the 1900s BCE. We're talking about a gap of 5 to 7 centuries. How can we possibly trust a document where the story was composed hundreds of years before the event it supposedly describes?
And that chronological mismatch is the entire crux of the debate. The scroll we have today is essentially a later scribal copy of a much older text.
So it's a reprint.
Yes.
Yeah.
To give you a modern analogy, imagine finding a mass-market paperback copy of a Shakespeare play. The physical book might have been printed and bound in 2024, but the these and thous, the grammatical structure, clearly belong to the late 1500s.
Oh, I see. You wouldn't say the story was written in 2024 just because the paper's new.
Exactly.
But if the language is definitively that old, how do archaeologists and historians who view this through a biblical lens deal with that timeline?
Well, it requires a significant paradigm shift. If you want to harmonize the Ipuwer Papyrus with the Book of Exodus, you essentially have two options.
Okay, what's option one?
The first option is to argue that traditional Egyptian chronology is fundamentally flawed. You have to propose shifting the dates of the Middle Kingdom forward by several centuries to make it overlap with the Exodus.
I imagine mainstream Egyptologists absolutely hate that idea. I mean, shifting an entire civilization's timeline isn't just tweaking a few dates. It throws off the dating of every other culture they interacted with across the Mediterranean.
Oh, they do. It is incredibly controversial and faces heavy pushback, which leads us to the second option.
Which is?
Assuming the text is actually describing an entirely different historical event that just happens to sound remarkably similar.
Really? Like what?
Some scholars suggest Ipuwer is actually describing the political collapse of the First Intermediate Period. This was a dark age in Egyptian history, a time of massive internal civil war, where central authority broke down, local governors seized power, and widespread famine took hold.
And during that breakdown of border security, there was a significant migration of people moving into Egypt, right?
Yes. During that earlier period of weakness, there was a massive influx of Asiatic peoples migrating into the Nile Delta region to escape famine in the Levant. They settled specifically in an area called Goshen, near modern Faqous.
Goshen. That is exactly where the biblical Israelites were said to have settled in Lower Egypt before they were enslaved.
Right. So the argument from this camp is that Ipuwer might be describing an earlier, very real conflict involving a Semitic population in the Delta during a time of national collapse.
Oh, I get it. And over centuries, the memory of that older catastrophe might have blended with later historical events to form the cultural memory that informed the biblical Exodus narrative.
That's the theory, yeah.
Because the linguistic roots of the words don't neatly align with the biblical timeline, the archaeological community is just deeply divided on how to interpret this document.
It's a tough gap to bridge.
So if the math doesn't add up for this to be a literal newspaper report of the Exodus, what did the original author actually think they were writing?
And that means we have to ask the fundamental question of genre. Are we reading a history book, or are we reading a highly stylized novel? There are two very distinct, conflicting academic views on this.
We should definitely present both of these views impartially because both sides bring incredibly compelling arguments to the table. Let's look at the first view, the historical sink argument.
Sure.
Proponents of a more literal biblical interpretation argue that you simply cannot ignore the sheer mathematical density of identical motifs.
They look at the text and point out that a river turning to blood, followed immediately by targeted pestilence, the death of children, a period of total darkness, and the sudden extreme enrichment of the slave class. It's just far too specific a sequence to be a coincidence.
It's the clustering of events, yeah. Any one of those things could be a metaphor. I mean, a writer could use a river of blood to symbolize a violent battle.
Sure, absolutely.
But all of them happening together in the exact same order. This camp views the Ipuwer Papyrus as a genuine historical chronicle of the Egyptian state collapsing following the events of the Exodus. They see it as the native Egyptian perspective on a shared historical trauma.
And standing in direct opposition to that is the literary topos argument. This is the view held by mainstream Egyptologists. They classify the Ipuwer Papyrus not as a historical record, but as lamentation or admonition literature.
Lamentation literature, so a specific genre of fictional writing closer to a tragedy or a political satire.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture of ancient Egyptian culture, we absolutely have to talk about the concept of ma'at. Ma'at was the ancient Egyptian concept of truth, balance, order, harmony, and law. But it wasn't just a legal concept. It was the divine religious order of the physical universe. It was gravity. The pharaoh's primary job, his most sacred daily duty, was to maintain ma'at. If he failed, the sun might not rise, the crops would fail, and the universe would unravel.
So keeping the pharaoh in power wasn't just about politics. It was about keeping the fabric of reality intact.
Precisely. And mainstream scholars argue that lamentation texts were well-established political devices used during the Middle Kingdom. Elite scribes would write these texts using extreme hyperbole and inverted imagery, like the king being overthrown by the poor, women becoming barren, or the life-giving river turning to blood.
Basically, to emphasize just how vital a strong central government was to maintaining Ma.
Yes, exactly that.
So it's essentially ancient state-sponsored propaganda. The scribes are writing these terrifying horror stories to say, look, if we don't support the pharaoh, if we let Matt slip, the whole universe will literally turn upside down. Slaves will rule, the water will become undrinkable, and the gods will abandon us.
It is the literary equivalent of a cautionary tale. It is designed to reinforce the status quo by showing the populace the most terrifying apocalyptic alternative imaginable.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Is this mainstream view essentially saying that someone thousands of years from now might dig up a pristine DVD of a zombie apocalypse movie and assume it is a literal historical documentary about life in the 2020s?
That is a brilliant analogy.
Because in reality, it was just a piece of fiction, an allegory we created to process our own modern societal anxieties.
That is exactly how mainstream Egyptologists view the literalist approach. They would say, reading the Ipuwer Papyrus as a historical account of the Exodus is exactly like a future historian watching a zombie movie and writing a serious academic paper on the great undead plague of 2024.
They think it just mistakes the genre entirely.
Right. They argue it is political poetry meant to provoke a psychological reaction, not a newspaper report.
That fundamentally changes how you experience the text. It shifts from being a documentary to being a thriller. So what does this all mean? We have this beautiful 4-meter scroll. We have the striking, undeniable parallels to the Book of Exodus.
And we have the chronological puzzle of an incredibly old story copied onto much newer paper.
Right, and we have this massive divide over whether it's a historical record of miracles or a piece of hyperbolic political poetry. Why does this single artifact command so much attention in the study of the ancient world?
It matters deeply for 3 distinct reasons. First, as we've discussed, it is a pivotal text in biblical archaeology. Regardless of whether scholars view it as literal history or literary fiction, it remains one of the most frequently cited extra-biblical documents.
It forces archaeologists to constantly reevaluate their timelines and test their assumptions about the relationship between ancient Israel and Egypt. It seems like, historical or not, it also serves as a roadmap to the ancient Egyptian psyche. It tells us what kept them up at night.
And that is the second reason. It is a psychological and sociological goldmine. The text provides irreplaceable insights into how ancient Egyptians processed the very idea of national disaster.
By showing us this inverted world.
Yes, it shows us their deepest existential fears. We get to see exactly what a breakdown of divine kingship looked like in their minds. It is a window into the psychology of an ancient superpower facing the terrifying concept of absolute collapse.
It tells us what they valued most by showing us what terrified them most to lose. And, I mean, just from a purely physical standpoint, having 4 meters of this cursive script must be an absolute treasure trove for anyone studying the language itself.
Oh, the third reason is purely scientific. The preservation of this hieratic script is vital for paleographers. Having a pristine, highly legible scroll of that length is incredibly rare.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It serves as a foundational artifact for understanding scribal transmission. You know, how language evolved over those 5 to 7 centuries and how delicate texts were meticulously copied and preserved by bureaucrats during the New Kingdom. It is basically a masterclass in ancient linguistics.
It really is a multifaceted treasure. But as we wrap up this deep dive, there is one final lingering detail from our sources that we haven't touched on yet. And honestly, it throws a massive wrench into that whole political propaganda theory.
Yes, this raises an important question for you to consider long after this deep dive is over. In the text, Ipuwer doesn't just complain about the river of blood or the slaves getting rich.
No, he doesn't.
He explicitly mentions that Egyptian magical spells and traditional religious protections have been rendered completely frustrated and ineffectual.
He openly states that the magic has failed. And that is a huge logical problem for the mainstream propaganda theory. Because if this text was purely a piece of political fiction designed by the elite scribes to promote Maat and reinforce their own religious order, why on earth would the author intentionally undermine their own culture by claiming their deeply revered magical spells were completely useless against this disaster?
The motivation just doesn't align. Why write a fictional story meant to save your religious authority if the story itself claims your religion doesn't work when you need it most?
Right.
Wouldn't admitting that the god's magic could be overridden destroy the very political and religious authority the scribe was trying to protect?
It is a massive, glaring contradiction, and it leaves the door wide open for the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the author was describing something real, something so terrifying, so systemic, and so completely inexplicable that they had no choice but to write it down and admit their magic couldn't stop it.
It definitely makes you wonder.
Next time you think about ancient history, imagine unrolling that crisp 4-meter scroll. You are looking at beautiful, flowing handwriting, but staring into a very dark, very complicated past. Is it the real-life horror of the Exodus, or is it the ultimate ancient political thriller? The ink may be dry, but the debate is still very much alive. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the past, and we'll see you next time.